is a piece of bisqueware, might be called a chuck, and it's stoneware. I threw it on the wheel and bisqued it to cone 06. I never want to bisque it hotter than that. It needs to remain porous. If you bisque too hot, it'll get too tight. And it helps to be stoneware because stoneware is really an open clay compared to porcelain, which is really tight. I let it dry to leather hard rather slowly because sometimes things that are tall and narrow like this will warp during drying. And then I turned it upside down in a leather hard cylinder and just lightly trimmed the edges to clean it up a bit. And I use this to trim almost all of the pots I make. Exceptions maybe plates and platters, lids, and probably a few other things. It's important that it's totally saturated in water. It's not enough to dip it, and it probably needs a minimum of about 10 minutes. I just keep mine soaking in water all the time, and then it's ready to go. I actually have a couple of these. This is the one I use the most. You can tell that the thing does have a little bit of movement to it, and that doesn't really matter too much. I always trim with this tool on a plastic bat because I'm sticking it down with moist clay, and if the bat is absorbent, this clay will dry out much faster and the piece will pop loose. I usually get a couple hours of working time out of a chuck. Usually I'll just have to recenter and switch this clay out and maybe the clay on top. I won't usually have to stop in the middle of a trimming session and re-soak the chuck. I'm gonna add a coil of clay to the top. The most recent version of this chuck, which is this one for me, I flared out a little bit at the top, and that just made it easier to stick clay to this top edge. And then you need to blend this clay really well into the chuck, or else it will stick more to the pot you're trimming than to the chuck, and it'll pop off. And I try to do as much centering as I can while the clay is still kind of drier or in this throwing dryness. And then I've used two techniques. Either one works. I don't really even have a preference. You can just let this clay get leather hard and then trim it to center, or you can compress it with a wet sponge and center it this way. This obviously adds a little bit of water and then just needs a little bit more drying time. Or what I usually do is just really lightly torch this surface and it gets to leather hard in just a second. And what's ideal is that this clay on the chuck is at the same stage of leather hard as the pot you're trimming. This chuck is now nice and leather hard up here, about the same as the bottom of the teapot, so they should stick well. And I just want to be careful sliding this over that I don't knock this edge into the flange. And then I'm going to get this centered as much as I can just by eye. It's a little tricky trimming on a chuck because I have to center not only side to side like normal, but also I have to make sure it's level. And this looks pretty close, and then I can just tap center to get it right. And trimming on the chuck like this is really handy on a teapot because otherwise all this weight, this 4+ pounds of clay, would be resting on this really kind of delicate edge of the gallery that I set up, and it would likely get destroyed with all the centering and then the pressure from trimming. It also means that it's stuck to and sealed to the bottom of the pot instead of the top of the pot. And that makes it much less likely to kind of pop loose from the wheel. And lastly, the chuck is supporting the bottom of the pot, and it's less likely to kind of cave in during trimming.